Celeste Morgan, a powerful black female CEO, stepped into the first-class cabin as usual, composed, confident, and with a pre-ordered meal of lobster bisque and premium steak. Everything should have been perfect. Instead, she was handed a cold sandwich and a glass of water. No apology, no explanation. While other passengers dined on caviar and champagne, she knew immediately this wasn't a mistake. It was a message, a silent rejection. For Celeste, it wasn't just about the missing meal. It was how the entire system whispered, "You don't belong here." But they had underestimated her. Because that moment on what seemed like an ordinary flight marked the beginning of a confrontation that would shake the entire airline industry. Let the story begin. Celeste Morgan boarded Stratus Air Flight 917 with unmistakable poise, confident calm, completely in command. She had nothing to prove. Her name alone was iconic in the global tech world. As the founder and CEO of Morgan Tech, a pioneering company in artificial intelligence and data security, Celeste had been named by Forbes 3 years in a row as one of the most globally influential women. Today's flight would take her to Geneva, where she was set to sign a multi-billion-dollar international merger, a deal that not only expanded Morgan Tech into the European market, but also marked a historic milestone, the first time a black woman held a leadership role in shaping the global tech landscape. She wore a navy blue tailored suit that hugged her tall, elegant frame. Her polished black leather shoes gleamed under the cabin's overhead lights. Her curls were neatly tied back in a low bun. Every detail on her spoke of professionalism and authority. Celeste walked with quiet determination. She didn't need to announce her presence, it was felt. Even those born and raised in privilege couldn't ignore her presence. As she gently placed her Hermes bag into the overhead compartment, a male flight attendant approached. He nodded politely, but barely glanced at her, shifting his attention almost immediately to a white male passenger entering just behind her. Celeste maintained a soft smile. She was used to moments like this when the world treated someone like her as if she were invisible. But she also understood it's in those small, quiet moments where big changes begin. Seat 1A. First seat the best view, and now the epicenter of an approaching storm. The first-class cabin surrounded Celeste in quiet luxury. Every stitch of leather, every drop of champagne in the crystal glass was meant for those at the very top of society. But to Celeste, that peak wasn't handed to her. She had climbed it with intellect, relentless effort, and unshakable resolve. No one gave her a place. She took it. On every previous flight with Stratus Air, she had always pre-ordered lobster bisque steak and a glass of Chateau Margaux Red. Not to flaunt it, but to affirm something quietly, yet powerfully, she belonged here. A black woman in a cabin often reserved for white suits, condescending glances, and performative handshakes. She turned on her tablet. The merger agreement between Morgan Tech and a leading Swiss cybersecurity firm glowed on the screen. This wasn't just a business expansion. It was a strategic chess move planned over 2 years. Everything was set. She didn't need to check the menu. Every item had been ordered well in advance. And for a VIP like her, those things were always guaranteed. Then came the footsteps, crisp, deliberate. A woman's voice so light it sent a chill down the spine. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Becky, and I'll be assisting you during this flight." Celeste looked up. Standing before her was a pale-faced flight attendant, Becky Whitmore. Blonde hair neatly tied, just enough makeup to look presentable, but not enough to mask the judgment in her eyes. Becky's gaze scanned Celeste from head to toe. pausing briefly on the delicate gold ring on her left hand. "I believe your team received my meal request last week," Celeste said softly, but with undeniable authority enough to make anyone second-guess underestimating her. Becky paused, offered a thin smile, and tilted her head slightly. "Of course, we'll be serving your meal once the aircraft reaches cruising altitude." Then she turned away, not forgetting to leave behind a cold glance, almost a sneer. Celeste frowned slightly, not because she knew Becky personally, but because she had met too many people like her. The ones who were just polite enough, yet always believed that power belonged to only one skin color. Another flight attendant passed by. His name was Daniel. He bowed slightly to the 3 white passengers seated just behind Celeste and greeted them politely by name. "Good afternoon, Mr. Radcliffe, Mr. Malcolm, and Mr. Clayton. It's an honor to serve you today." Soft laughter echoed from behind, followed by the gentle clink of glasses. A man's voice chimed in. "Caviar before takeoff like this? This flight is going to be something special." Celeste didn't need to turn around. She didn't need to see to know exactly what was happening, but the chill down her spine that was real. It had been a long time since she had so clearly felt the invisible line between sitting in first class and truly being welcome in first class. She set her tablet down. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, rhythmically, steadily. Each tap was like the beat of a drum, heralding the approach of something inevitable. A shift. Because if Becky thought a meal could define who mattered, then the woman sitting in 1A was about to show her just how wrong she was. The sound of high heels echoed once more on the carpeted aisle. Becky Whitmore returned holding a meal tray, uncovered unlike the usual protocol. She stopped in front of Celeste, her voice flat and cold. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we've run out of premium meals. We only have cold chicken sandwiches and water left." Celeste narrowed her eyes, turning to face her directly. "I placed my meal order a week ago. I have the confirmation email booking code and even a reminder from Stratus," she said, calm, but with unmistakable authority. Becky shrugged, swinging the little notebook in her hand dismissively, as if it didn't matter. Maybe the system didn't update. It happens all the time. Then she turned and walked away. No apology, no backward glance. At that very moment in the hushed and opulent space of first class, Celeste no longer heard the quiet conversations, no longer saw the warm light reflected in other passengers' wine glasses. Everything disappeared except the cold meal tray in front of her. Like a slap in the face. A cold sandwich, a cheap paper napkin, a half-filled plastic cup of water, no silverware, no linen-lined tray, no trace of what should have been a first-class meal, and certainly not for a CEO about to speak at the European Economic Forum. Celeste sat up straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't touch the tray not out of pride, but because she wanted to feel the insult in full. She wasn't going to ignore it. She wouldn't forget. She needed to remember every detail from Becky's eyes to the laughter behind her, to the silence that surrounded her. 6 white men, 6 custom-tailored suits, 6 glasses of champagne raised beneath the soft cabin light. And not a single one, not one pair of eyes turned towards Celeste. No one asked why the only black woman in the cabin was sitting with a meal that belonged in economy. No one questioned it. No one cared. Or perhaps they were just used to people like her being overlooked. But Celeste Morgan was not the kind of person who stayed silent when pushed aside. She didn't get angry. She didn't lash out. But inside her, a quiet storm had begun to form. A storm Becky Whitmore, with her polite smile and condescending manner, had no idea she had just ignited. A storm that would not only shake an individual's career, but hold an entire system accountable. The faded silver tray placed in front of Celeste was a clear symbol of rejection. The cold chicken sandwich sat limply between two bland slices of bread next to a wilted piece of lettuce, a thin paper napkin, and a half-filled cup of water. No silverware, no linen-lined tray, no sign that this was a meal for a first-class passenger. And worse, this was how they served a female CEO invited to speak at the European Economic Forum. Celeste remained still, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She didn't touch the tray, not out of pride, but because she wanted to remember this moment in full, this insult. Every glance that passed her by, every soft laugh from behind, every second of silence from those around her, all of it was worth remembering. Because she knew true change only begins when people refuse to forget. Celeste looked around the cabin. Seat 1C, Mr. Radcliffe, CEO of a venture capital firm who once declined to invest in Morgan Tech because of its lack of high-level leadership experience. Seat 1D, Mr. Malcolm, a strategic analyst who once questioned at a conference whether women of color were capable of leading in high-tech industries. Seat 2A, Mr. Clayton, founder of a financial trading platform, who had been accused of harassing a black female employee but never formally investigated. All three of these men were being served Michelin standard dinners, while Celeste, who had met every criterion, surpassed every benchmark, sat with a tray of cold food. She closed her eyes. There was no more anger, only a deep weariness, the feeling of someone who had climbed to the top of the mountain only to be pulled back by an invisible rope called prejudice. But today she wasn't just going to keep climbing. She was going to tear the mountain down. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, but through action, precise, unwavering, and irreversible. She opened her smartwatch and accessed Morgan Tech's secure internal app, equipped with real-time data tracking tools. With just a few taps, she pulled up personnel records from the airline's first-class reservation system. Name: Rebecca Ann Whitmore. Position: lead, flight attendant Stratus Air. Employee ID STA9035. The information began to appear. Celeste saw several cracks in Becky's file: 2 passenger complaints for discriminatory service, 1 internal email stating prioritize guests who tip well. No explicit racial bias documented, but the language clearly showed a tendency to rank passengers. Celeste saved everything. Then she sent an encrypted message to her executive assistant, Aaliyah Grant. Activate emergency audit protocol. Flight 917. Attendant code STA9035. Confirm within 10 minutes. Every word she typed carried no emotion, but beneath it was a deadly resolve. Not just for Becky, but for the entire system that nurtured people like Becky. She turned off the screen, her gaze no longer focused on the meal tray. She looked straight ahead toward the faint cockpit light, signaling that the long runway had come into view. By now, this was no longer about food, no longer about unprofessional behavior. This was a declaration. Under the soft lighting of the first-class cabin, Celeste closed her eyes, but her mind was fully alert. Like a machine rebooting after a long pause, every memory, every glance, every cold remark from the past came rushing back like waves. She remembered the first time she entered the boardroom at Sterling Capital. She was only 33, then there to present an AI security platform she had personally developed. Dressed impeccably confident early and thoroughly prepared. But as she walked in, a white man didn't even look at her. He turned to the secretary and said, "Can I get a cup of coffee?" Celeste wasn't angry. She simply smiled and replied, I'll bring you that coffee if you agree to let me present the $15 million plan right afterward. The entire room went silent, and from that moment on, no one ever mistook her for the assistant again. But not everyone learns that lesson. Becky Whitmore, the epitome of someone coddled by social privilege. She never had to fight for her place, never faced rejection because of the color of her skin. She might not have uttered slurs or used offensive language, but the shrug, the silence, the indifferent gaze, those were the languages of modern discrimination, cold, quiet, but cutting deeper than words. Celeste glanced around the cabin again. Seat 1C, Mr. Radcliffe, who once said, "I won't invest in Morgan Tech until they have a more experienced leader." Seat 1D, Mr. Malcolm, who once questioned at a conference whether women of color were capable of running a high-tech company. Seat 2A, Mr. Clayton, accused of harassing a black female employee but never investigated. All of them were being served like royalty, and she was not. Celeste closed her eyes again, but now what she felt wasn't hurt. It was resolve. Not to reclaim a meal, but to dismantle the system that had quietly excluded people like her just because they were different. She reopened her smartwatch. A confirmation signal from Aaliyah had come through. Accessed personnel file. Detected pattern of repeated bias. Recommend full investigation. Celeste nodded slightly. There was no victorious smile, just an affirmation that she had been right. And worse, that they had allowed it to happen for years without anyone speaking up. Becky wasn't just an individual who slipped up. Becky was the product of an entire flawed culture, a system where discrimination wears the mask of polite smiles and crisp white napkins, where indifference is rebranded as professionalism, where apologies are never spoken aloud. Celeste continued scrolling through the records. She flagged 3 flight attendants with a high volume of complaints, including Becky. Then she opened the internal policy manual of Stratus Air. Any discriminatory or preferential behavior in service, even without explicit language, if proven through repeated actions, will be subject to disciplinary measures under international aviation ethics standards. Celeste smiled, not out of satisfaction, but because she knew this time her silence wasn't weakness. It was a form of power. She tapped send on the report summary, requesting an internal investigation addressed directly to the CEO of Stratus Air, and copied in the 3 attorneys who had stood with her in previous discrimination lawsuits. Requesting immediate investigation into Flight 917 crew. Urgent. She folded her phone, closed her eyes, rested her head on the soft leather of the first-class seat. The sky outside remained peaceful, but beneath the clouds a storm had begun, and Celeste Morgan was its eye. On the other side of the globe, in the 42nd floor office of Morgan Tech in Manhattan, Aaliyah Grant Celeste's senior executive assistant was working non-stop. The 29-year-old woman had her natural curls tied tightly behind her head, signaling she was in full battle mode. The only light in the room came from the LED screen reflecting off her thick glasses. The keyboard clicks echoed like the heartbeat of a system preparing to expose the truth. Celeste didn't need to explain much, just a few lines of text with the right keywords, and Aaliyah understood. Between them, trust wasn't built on words, but on the precision of action. Aaliyah accessed the internal analytics dashboard, connecting to airline databases and international partner records. Within 90 seconds, the first profile appeared. Rebecca Ann Whitmore, Chief Flight Attendant, Employee ID ST-A9035, employed since 2018. Everything looked standard at first glance, but Aaliyah didn't stop there. She opened the customer feedback files from the past 3 years, focusing on flights where Becky had served. And then the suspicious patterns began to emerge. February 2022. A black passenger was denied pre-ordered wine without clear explanation. September 2022. 2 Asian passengers were served last, despite boarding early. March 2023. An Indian businesswoman received no response after pressing the call button 3 times. None of the cases resulted in disciplinary action. The familiar reason: insufficient evidence for misconduct. Aaliyah frowned. She knew people like Becky knew how to skirt the rules. No shouting, no slurs, just quiet disregard for those deemed less worthy. And the system had allowed her to operate like that for nearly 6 years. Aaliyah launched the advanced data matching tool, pairing it with a behavioral recognition system. She and Celeste had developed a proprietary Morgan Tech tool. It analyzed tone of voice, facial expressions, response times, and engagement patterns across passenger groups. The results made Aaliyah smirk coldly. Behavioral bias. Index, 87.4%. Repeated discriminatory service to non-white passengers. Recorded 15 instances over 36 flights. Alert high organizational culture risk. Recommend full investigation. Aaliyah flagged the entire data set. She generated a secured encrypted PDF report and linked it to the company's internal evidence vault. She sent the report to the emergency inbox of the executive board, a channel reserved for incidents impacting strategic partnerships or brand reputation. At the same time, she forwarded a copy to 3 senior leaders at Stratus Air, including CEO Charles Edmonds, a longtime strategic ally of Morgan Tech. She knew Edmonds wouldn't take this lightly, not out of fear of Celeste, but because he understood one thing. When Celeste Morgan took action, it was never personal. It was systemic. Less than 5 minutes later, Aaliyah's screen vibrated gently. A notification appeared. Investigation order issued. HR and legal teams will be on site at arrival to conduct immediate review. Thank you for bringing this to light. Aaliyah exhaled softly, leaning back in her chair. She didn't feel relieved. She knew this was only the beginning. After years working alongside Celeste, she had seen her boss outmaneuver major banks, aggressive venture capitalists, and slippery politicians. But never had Celeste issued an audit now command, unless the reason was deeply, unshakably justified. 2 a.m. in New York. On Flight 917 in Seat 1A, Celeste still hadn't slept. Becky Whitmore, still smiling, moving between rows with her usual air of professional confidence, had no idea that the world around her was beginning to collapse. Celeste gave a subtle nod, eyes sharp as steel. Her voice remained calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had stared down rotten systems and made them bow. No shouting, no arguing, just precise action at the right moment. And now everything she needed to do had already been set in motion. Celeste pressed the call button. The soft ting echoed quiet enough not to draw attention from other passengers, but just clear enough to summon the crew. A middle-aged man approached, neat-build, salt and pepper hair combed back. The nameplate on his chest read, Daniel Clean. He slowed down as he neared Seat 1A. There was a flicker of caution in his eyes, as if his instincts were warning him this woman wasn't an ordinary passenger. Celeste looked him straight in the eye, her voice calm and even, but sharp as a blade. I'd like to follow up on the meal I pre-ordered. Daniel stood straighter, placing a hand on his tray as if to steady himself. Yes, ma'am. Celeste cut him off. She didn't raise her voice, but it was sharp enough to make his next words die in his throat. I heard Ms. Whitmore say we prioritize certain passengers. What exactly does that mean? Daniel froze. He glanced around as if looking for an escape from an innocent question, but he knew too well this wasn't just a question. It was a linguistic trap, a question that would be remembered, a question that could become evidence in a formal inquiry. He stammered, I think. Perhaps that was a miscommunication. We don't have a discriminatory policy. It's just that sometimes we consider things like meal order timing, flight frequency. Celeste tilted her head slightly, her gaze razor sharp. I'm a Diamond Plus member. Ordered my meal 7 days in advance. I have the confirmation email and booking code. In this cabin, I'm the only one who didn't receive a premium meal. So, if that's not discrimination, what is it? Daniel remained silent. A small bead of sweat formed on his temple despite the cool cabin air. He didn't have the courage to argue, but he didn't have the spine to admit the truth either. Celeste gave a faint smile, the kind that cuts like a knife sliding across glass. No need to answer. I understand. Daniel bowed slightly and turned away, his steps quicker than usual, like a fox slipping out of a spotlight. But he didn't realize Celeste didn't need a spoken answer. Everything she needed was already in her hands. She tapped her smartwatch. An update from Aaliyah had just arrived. Investigation order approved by Stratus Air CEO. HR and legal teams will be waiting in Geneva upon landing. Code Red Line 917. Red Line 917, the internal code for incidents with the potential to cause severe strategic-level brand damage. According to protocol, this meant the entire flight crew would be monitored immediately after disembarkation. All in-flight camera footage would be secured and reviewed. An emergency meeting with HR, legal, and the regional director would be held the moment the plane touched down. Anyone involved would be suspended within 24 hours. All of it had been triggered, and Celeste was the one who launched it with a single press of send. Farther down the cabin, Becky Whitmore was still chatting cheerfully with Mr. Radcliffe. Every step she took between the rows, every movement, even if unconscious, was testifying against her. She didn't know that her behavior, tone, eye contact, and interactions were being recorded by the cabin's AI-powered surveillance system. A system co-developed with Morgan Tech, integrated to protect the rights of VIP passengers. Celeste exhaled softly, but there was no weakness in it. This was why she didn't react immediately to the insult. She didn't need to argue. She needed collapse. She opened her tablet, accessed her profile in the Stratus Air partner system. Everything was flawless. 10 consecutive years as a Diamond Plus member. An average of 12 first-class flights per year. One of 50 VIP guests invited to provide feedback for service innovation last year. She marked it all. A perfect record. No loopholes, no emotion, just truth. Because Celeste wasn't acting out of personal offense. She acted because if she stayed silent, people like her women of color, entrepreneurs, founders, would always be pushed aside. She couldn't let that happen. Not while sitting in Seat 1A, a seat she had fought for through youth tears and countless moments of being dismissed. The aircraft shuddered lightly. The pilot announced the descent. Becky passed by again. Her gaze slid past Celeste like she wasn't even there. The same familiar indifference. The same invisible chill Celeste had faced her entire career. But this time, that silence would have to speak. And that voice would be irreversible. The plane began its descent. The soft screech of the landing gear against the runway echoed subtle but decisive, like a bell signaling that everything was about to change. Celeste opened her eyes. She didn't rush to unbuckle her seatbelt. She didn't reach for her luggage. She sat still, head slightly tilted, as if listening to the rhythm of the air around her. But, in truth, she was listening for something else. The sound of passengers exhaling in relief, the hurried footsteps of the crew, and two soft vibrations from her smartwatch, two signals indicating that every link in the chain was now in place. Aliyah had completed and sent the full report, including a behavioral analysis of Becky's service from cabin footage, time discrepancies in service between Celeste and the other white passengers, passenger-taken images capturing the moment Becky denied Celeste her pre-ordered meal. The final message had been sent 3 minutes before touchdown. Its content was a single line: forward file to the Ethics Council of Service, high priority, Code Geneva 1A. As the plane came to a complete stop, Celeste unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, smoothed the hem of her blazer, and slung her leather bag over her shoulder. No rush, no expression. She stepped into the aisle, her movement steady and grounded. Behind her, other passengers were still rummaging for their bags and chatting cheerfully. No one realized the woman walking away from seat 1A had just changed the entire airline industry on a single flight. At the aircraft door, two people stood waiting. A man in a dark suit and a petite woman with sharp eyes and a name badge that clearly read Legal Geneva Office. Both bowed slightly as Celeste approached. "Welcome, Ms. Morgan. We sincerely apologize for..." Celeste didn't stop walking. She simply glanced at them and spoke quietly, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "No need to apologize. This is just the beginning. No further words, no handshake, no turning back." But just behind her, Brandon Ellis, European Regional Director of Stratus, and his accompanying legal counsel stood straight, their faces solemn. They knew. They had read the report. They knew what awaited them on the other side of the Ethics Council's door, and they understood this was no longer a service mishap. This was a cultural failure, and now they would pay for it. Meanwhile, at the rear of the aircraft, the crew began disembarking through the back exit as usual. Becky Whitmore walked in front, still with that proud stride, heels clacking against the floor, her blonde hair neatly pinned up, her face wearing that familiar permanent smile, the kind that had been worn too long to know whether it was real or fake anymore. In her mind, this flight had been just like any other. One difficult passenger, one minor situation. Becky thought, just another CEO making a fuss over some lobster, nothing serious. She even imagined herself later that night, back at her usual hotel, sipping her favorite martini, telling her friends about a dramatic black passenger. But then, as they passed through the door leading to the HR zone, everything shifted. No more red carpet, no more welcoming smiles. Instead, a waiting group, 3 men in black suits from internal security, 2 senior HR staff, red badges on their lanyards signifying the emergency review team, a lawyer holding an iPad and a thick file stamped in red top secret, service ethics audit. No one on the crew said a word. No more laughter, no more confidence. The air was like a courtroom, cold, controlled, and inescapable. At the center of the group stood Karen Dufresne Stratus's Global Director of Service Culture. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word sliced through the silence. "All crew members from Flight 917, please proceed to emergency interview, room 2. This is a mandatory hearing under Section 6.3, Global Service Ethics Code." A male flight attendant behind Becky turned and looked at her, eyes confused. Becky almost asked, "What's going on?" But Karen's icy gaze made her swallow the words. The list had been finalized. The files had been locked. And from that moment forward, they were no longer the off-duty flight crew. They were individuals under formal investigation for severe violations of professional ethics. They were led into a narrow hallway lined with 6 small rooms, each person in their own. No phones, no colleagues, no one to lean on. Each room was equipped with a surveillance camera, a senior HR official, and a lawyer observing from across the table. Becky entered sitting upright at the metal chair. She tried to remain calm, but inside her nerves were unraveling. The woman sitting across from her didn't speak right away. She opened a thick file, eyes fixed on the pages in front of her. "Ms. Whitmore, we will be asking you several questions regarding your service conduct on Flight 917, as well as on other flights within the past 24 months. This interrogation is being recorded and may be used as evidence in disciplinary proceedings, including immediate suspension if a violation is found." Becky swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. The interrogator turned on a tablet. A video appeared. In the footage, Becky's face was cold as she handed a food tray to Celeste Morgan. Perhaps the system didn't update. This happens frequently. Celeste didn't show anger. She simply stared at Becky with a calm that was terrifying. "Do you recall this situation?" the interrogator asked. Becky stammered. Can you explain why 5 other passengers received their pre-ordered meals, but the passenger in seat 1A did not?" Becky looked down. "Maybe the system glitched. We've checked. The system confirmed the meal was ordered 7 days in advance with email verification and a check-in confirmation. Would you like to add anything else?" Becky couldn't respond. Her eyes flickered. Her breathing quickened. For the first time in her life, she realized every shrug, every dismissive refusal, every condescending glance, the things she once considered normal or professional, were now evidence. This wasn't about today. This was the reckoning of dozens of flights before. At Stratus headquarters in Geneva, CEO Charles Edmonds sat alone in conference room 1. In front of him were 3 files submitted by the preliminary investigation team. The cover pages read, "Proposal for indefinite suspension, Rebecca Whitmore, Behavioral Bias System. Recommendation for complete service training. Reform, formal recommendation. Appoint Celeste Morgan as independent service culture advisor." Edmonds didn't need to reread them. He already knew an era at Stratus had ended. Not because the media exposed it, not because public outrage exploded, but because one woman who walked out of seat 1A carried with her the calm conviction that justice does not need to shout to be heard. That very afternoon, an internal memorandum was sent to all Stratus employees worldwide. The header was marked red. Mandatory response required. Emergency notice, immediate suspension of employee Rebecca Whitmore. Initiate full restructuring of first-class service training. The document was personally signed by CEO Charles Edmonds, accompanied by an unprecedented statement from a premium airline. "We acknowledge that subtle discriminatory behaviors have been ignored within our internal systems. This is a moment when Stratus must not only take responsibility, but must also change." At the HR office in Geneva, Becky Whitmore sat silently. Her head hung low. She still clutched her personal file. Her face had gone pale, not just because she had been suspended, but because she was beginning to realize all the things she had once seen as normal were now evidence against her. In the system's data archive, emails that once seemed harmless were being retrieved and analyzed. Black passengers act like they're CEOs. People of color always need attention. I just deal with them quickly and move on. Another Michelle Obama clone. Bread and water should be enough. What was once brushed off as hallway gossip was now being processed through language monitoring systems, becoming irrefutable evidence. Becky was no longer the only one under scrutiny. Two other crew members, including Daniel Clean, the flight attendant who dodged Celeste's question, were also placed under behavioral review. Every flight they had ever worked, every quiet complaint from non-white passengers, every forgotten service, every ignored call button, all of it was now under investigation, line by line, moment by moment. The shockwave didn't stop within Stratus. Within just 24 hours of the incident, major media outlets had picked up the story. The New York Times black CEO discriminated against on flight, power no longer silent. The Guardian 1. Denied meal unravels the illusion of luxury service. Forbes Celeste Morgan, from Target to global service reform leader. In the social justice section of the Washington Post, a short clip from the cabin camera was shared millions of times. In it, Celeste Morgan says just one sentence: "I understand." No outrage, no table pounding, no dramatic protest. Just a cold, unwavering acknowledgement that she had seen everything, and this time she wasn't going to let it happen again. Soon after, social media ignited a movement under the hashtag #CestOne. Thousands of people around the world shared their own experiences. Being dismissed from meetings because they didn't look like a leader. Being served after others despite arriving first. Being called buddy while white peers were addressed as sir or ma'am. And every story ended with the same line: "I wasn't sitting in seat 1A, but I deserve respect." Stratus's New York office received over 9,000 emails demanding a full cultural overhaul. The London branch received letters from 3 major investors requesting an internal summit on diversity and equity in the corporate structure. CEO Charles Edmonds received a direct call from the U.S. Secretary of Transportation requiring Stratus to submit a formal report on its corporate culture and equity practices in premium aviation. And Celeste Morgan. She didn't appear at any press conference. She didn't grant an interview to CNN. She didn't speak with the BBC. She didn't need to say anything else, because her actions had already spoken. Inside a small conference room overlooking Lake Geneva, Celeste wasn't meeting with the media. She was sitting with 3 young women, all women of color. They worked in the service industry. They had been overlooked, belittled, and had told themselves, "Even if I speak up, no one will believe me." One of them nervously asked, "Ms. Celeste, how did you find the courage to speak out like that?" Celeste shook her head. Her gaze was steady. "I didn't speak with words. I let the system reveal its own truth, and this time I forced it to stop looking away." Outside the glass window, Lake Geneva lay still and silent, but beneath the surface, powerful undercurrents were moving. Just like the quiet but unstoppable changes now spreading, all from seat 1A on a flight Becky Whitmore would never forget. After Stratus officially launched its first-class service culture reform program, Celeste Morgan left Geneva 3 days later and returned to the U.S. No closing speech, no awards, no need for recognition. She had never needed the spotlight to prove her worth. What she left behind was a new standard, a quiet reminder the world wouldn't soon forget. True power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to act at the right moment. A soft press of a call button, a simple question, a short message, and an entire system had to bow and change. Since that incident, every time a person of color boards the first-class cabin, the reception is no longer the same. Gone are the strange glances. Gone is the discreet disregard. Gone is the kind of by-the-book service that lacks soul, because now no one is certain whether the person in seat 2C, 4A, or a 7D might just be the next Celeste Morgan. At an international conference on equality in the service industry, a video clip was played as the opening no dialogue, just solemn background music. Footage from the passenger camera on Flight 917, Celeste Morgan, sitting upright in seat 1A. In front of her, a cold sandwich, a glass of water, and eyes filled with defiance. The video had once been shared more than 20 million times worldwide. The hashtag #WarjuSeat1A continued to spread, becoming the symbol of a silent revolution. One autumn day, Celeste boarded another business flight from Atlanta to Cape Town, where she was invited to speak at the Global Leadership Forum. No one knew who she was. She asked for no special treatment, introduced no title. She simply checked in like any other passenger. But when she entered the first-class cabin, she noticed something unexpected. On the headrest of seat 1A, a small silver plaque had been stitched into the fabric. Reserved seat of change, and beneath it, just 3 words. We remember you. Celeste smiled gently. She didn't say a word. She sat down and fastened her seatbelt. The plane began to roll. The sky outside was just as blue as always, but this time it felt wider, because now it made room for those who were once told, "You don't belong." All it took was a rejected meal, a cold stare, an action that seemed small. Yet that moment revealed an entire system of discrimination hidden behind the label of professional service. And Celeste Morgan didn't need to raise her voice, or get angry, or create a scene. She only needed a calm gaze and action taken at the right moment, and a belief that real change must begin at the very place where people were once rendered invisible. At the Morgan Tech headquarters on a quiet weekend afternoon, Celeste sat alone in her office. She wasn't working. She was writing a letter, handwritten, a rare act in the digital age. Blue ink, clean white paper, neat deliberate lines. The recipient, a 16-year-old girl from Florida, who had written to Celeste after reading the Forbes article. The girl shared how a school career counselor once told her, "Someone like you should go into service work. High tech isn't for you." Celeste replied in her letter, "There will be people who think you don't deserve positions they've never seen someone like you occupy. Don't be angry about it. Remember, you don't need to make noise to prove yourself. You just need to show up at the right moment and never back down." At the end, she added a handwritten postscript. P.S. Never forget you have the right to sit in seat 1A. If someone says no, ask them, who was this system made for? Celeste Morgan didn't change the world with a speech, not with a protest, not with a crowd or a slogan. She changed the world with a single refusal of a cold sandwich, with a quiet line, "I understand." And from that moment forward, every seat 1A was never the same again. What about you? Have you ever been made to feel small in a place where you absolutely deserve to be seen? Would you choose silence or choose to speak? Share your story below. If Celeste's journey made you think tap, share this message and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Because sometimes the spark that changes an entire system begins with just one person sitting in the seat they deserve.